We begin our story not with triumph, but with silence. A deafening silence. The kind that falls after the screams have faded and the last fire has died. The year is 136 AD. Before us lies a landscape that could have been painted by a god of destruction. The land of Judea, tortured, scorched, desolate. Imagine a slow pan over ruins that were once thriving cities, over fields sown with salt, over the husks of burned synagogues, their charred stones crying out to the sky. Ancient chroniclers, like Cassius Dio, would later report nearly 600,000 dead in battle, thousands sold into slavery, 50 fortresses destroyed, and 985 villages erased from the face of the earth. This is not simply the outcome of a war. It is the result of methodical, cold, and deliberate annihilation, a wound inflicted on history itself. And over this ash heap hangs the shadow of one man, a man whose coins were minted with the inscription, Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. Emperor Publius Aelius Hadrian. How could this intellectual, this philosopher, architect, and patron of the arts, the man who built the famous wall in Britain not for conquest, but for defense, become the author of this apocalypse? What is the root of this monstrous paradox? Historians would seek answers in politics, in strategy, in the clash of irreconcilable cultures. But to get closer to the truth, we must ask another, far stranger question, one that seems to have no connection to the slaughter. We must ask, how is this scorched earth connected to a drowned boy? How is the ash of Judea linked to the ghost of a beautiful young man named Antinous, whose body, just a few years earlier, was swallowed by the murky, mysterious waters of the Nile? The truth is, these two tragedies, the death of a people and the death of one person, are inseparably bound in the emperor's soul. They are two sides of the same coin, two expressions of the same all-consuming passion, the same titanic will that sought to build paradise on earth, but did not hesitate to create hell for those who did not fit into that paradise. To understand Hadrian's actions, we must understand the world he inherited, a world that had reached its zenith and peered over the edge into an abyss of uncertainty. By 117 AD, at the death of Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire was a grandiose but critically overextended entity. It was like a giant athlete whose muscles had reached their limit and begun to tear under their own weight. The borders stretched from the misty wastes of Scotland to the scorching sands of Mesopotamia, from the cataracts of the Nile to the banks of the Rhine and Danube. Trajan, the last great conqueror, the Optimus Princeps, had pushed Roman expansionism to its logical and physical limit. His campaigns in Dacia and Parthia brought Rome untold riches and new provinces, but they also drained the treasury and stretched the legions thin along thousands of kilometers of hostile frontiers. Embers of resistance glowed everywhere, in newly conquered Mesopotamia, in Britain, in Judea, where memories of Titus's destruction of the temple were still fresh. The empire was like a great bonfire into which too much fuel had been thrown. It burned brightly, but at any moment it could burn out and collapse into ash. In Rome itself, in the halls of the Senate and among the educated elite, a demand for change was brewing. Stoic philosophy, gaining popularity, spoke not of conquest, but of duty, order, preservation, and management. It was becoming clear that the era of endless expansion, the era when problems could be solved by a new victorious war, was ending. The world needed not a new Alexander, but a new Augustus. Not a conqueror, but an administrator. Not a general, but an architect. Someone was needed who could say enough, Who would dare to draw a line in the sand and declare that beyond it lay not a barbarian world to be conquered, but simply an other world to be defended against? This demand for stability, for consolidation, for peace through defense, was the historical context that produced the phenomenon of Hadrian. He came to power not to expand the empire, but to save it from itself, from its own insatiable ambitions. And herein lay the first irony of his reign. To become a peacemaker, he had to begin with an act that many considered betrayal and cowardice. Publius alias Hadrian did not belong to the old Italian aristocracy. His roots were in the Spanish city of Italica, founded by Scipio's veterans. He was a descendant of colonists, a provincial, though from a very noble family related to Trajan himself. This provincialism left a permanent mark on him. He thought not in terms of one city, Rome, but of the entire vast inhabited world. But his path to power was not direct. Trajan, though he favored his distant relative, delayed naming a successor until the very end. When the emperor died in Cilicia in 117 AD, his will, in which he supposedly adopted Hadrian, was presented by his widow, the influential and intelligent empress Pompeia Plotina. Rumors immediately spread through Rome that the will was forged, that the adoption had happened on his deathbed or even after his death, and that Hadrian owed the throne not to the emperor's will, but to his wife's intrigue. This shadow of illegitimacy, this last-minute adoption, would haunt Hadrian for his entire reign. He knew that in the eyes of many senators, he was an outsider, a man who owed everything to a woman. This forced him to seek support, not in traditional institutions, but in the army, which he knew and loved, and in the creation of a new, loyal bureaucracy. But above all, it created in him a deep need to constantly prove his right to rule. To prove it not by force of arms, like Trajan, but by force of intellect, will, and the grandeur of his vision. He had to become not just another emperor, but the best, wisest, most effective ruler in Roman history, so that history itself would justify his questionable ascension. This inner insecurity, hidden behind a mask of stoic calm and intellectual superiority, became the most powerful engine of his reforms. He had to rebuild the empire, to make it so perfect, so logical and stable that no one could doubt. He, and no one else, was destined for this mission. From his earliest years, Hadrian was marked by a sense of otherness, which both distinguished him and created a distance between him and the typical Roman elite. His passionate, almost religious reverence for Greek culture was so obvious that he earned the nickname Graculus, the Little Greek. It was a name that held both mockery and reluctant admiration for his erudition. For most Romans, Greece was a venerable but conquered cradle of civilization. For Hadrian, it was a living, breathing ideal, a model for imitation in everything from art and architecture to philosophy and lifestyle. He spoke fluent Greek, wrote poetry, studied the works of Epictetus and Plato, and admired Pericles and Alexander. This was not just an aristocratic hobby, it was his worldview, his political and aesthetic program. He saw the future of the Roman Empire not as the triumph of the Latin spirit over barbarians, but as the creation of a single, syncretic Greco-Roman world, where the best achievements of both cultures would merge into a new, higher civilization. He dreamed of an empire where an inhabitant of Britain and an inhabitant of Syria would both feel like citizens of one great Hellenic civilization, united by common values, language, and aesthetics. In this vision lay both a prophecy of his future achievements and the seeds of future conflict. His love for Greece was the driving force behind his grand building projects in Athens, his reforms aimed at unifying law and administration. But it also made him blind and intolerant of those cultures that categorically did not fit into his Hellenic utopia. He could understand and even respect German barbarians or Parthian nobles. They were simply other, external forces. But he could not understand or accept the stubborn monotheism and cultural exclusivity of the Jews, who lived in the very heart of his empire, but refused to dissolve into this melting pot of civilizations. Their refusal to accept his gods, their loyalty to one invisible and jealous God, was not just a political problem for him. It was an aesthetic monstrosity, a philosophical error that had to be corrected. Thus, the nickname Little Greek, given to him in his youth, proved prophetic. It was his obsession with the Hellenic ideal of harmony and universalism that ultimately led him to the most disharmonious and brutal war of his reign. The future emperor's character was forged in a unique crucible, where the heat of legionary camps on the frontiers mixed with the cool of Athenian libraries. Hadrian was not a coddled aristocrat raised in metropolitan luxury. His career, like that of many in his circle, passed through the harsh school of military service. He was a legionary tribune in Upper Pannonia, then in Lower Moesia, and he participated in Trajan's Dacian wars, where he proved himself a brave warrior and a competent commander. He knew the common soldier up close, his needs, his language, his life. He slept on the hard ground, ate rough food, and marched under a scorching sun and freezing rain. This military hardening gave him pragmatism, discipline, an understanding of logistics and strategy, and the ability to command respect and loyalty from the common legionaries, which would become a key pillar of his power. But unlike many commanders for whom war was their only calling, Hadrian lived a double life. Every free moment he devoted to his true passion, knowledge. He was an insatiable reader, his interests ranging from poetry and rhetoric to mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. He didn't just read. He strove for mastery in everything he touched. He designed buildings himself, wrote poetry and prose, and held philosophical debates. This fusion of soldier and intellectual, pragmatist and theorist created a unique personality. He could debate the subtleties of Platonic philosophy for hours, then personally inspect the construction of fortifications, making precise engineering observations. He could write a delicate poem about the fleetingness of life, and then develop new tactics for the cavalry. This very duality is the key to his contradiction. His soldier's mind demanded order, clear borders, discipline, and efficiency, hence his walls, his army reforms, his ruthless suppression of any unrest. But his aesthete's soul yearned for beauty, harmony, and eternity embodied in Greek art, hence his building projects, his Philhellenism, and ultimately, his tragic obsession with Antinous. His entire life became an attempt to reconcile these two principles, to bring military order to the world and, simultaneously, to turn it into a work of art. But when the world refused to obey his will, it was not the philosopher who spoke, but the centurion, ready to impose his version of harmony with fire and sword. Barely established on the throne, Hadrian did something that plunged Roman society into a state of shock and profound confusion. He ordered the abandonment of Mesopotamia and Assyria, provinces conquered by Trajan during his final triumphant campaign against Parthia. The legions standing on the banks of the Tigris were pulled back to the Euphrates. This was unheard of. Rome did not surrender conquered land. The refusal of new territories was seen as a sign of weakness, cowardice, and, worst of all, a betrayal of the legacy of the best princeps, Trajan, whose glory was built on military victories. Senators grumbled. Generals who dreamed of Parthian triumphs gritted their teeth. Hadrian was accused of destroying the fruits of his predecessor's greatest victories out of jealousy. But for Hadrian himself, this was not an act of weakness, but an act of supreme state pragmatism, his first and most important political declaration. He understood, like no one else, that the empire had reached its limit. Holding these distant and hostile Mesopotamian lands required huge garrisons, stretched supply lines, and constantly provoked the Parthians into retaliatory strikes. It was a bleeding wound on the body of the empire, draining its resources. Hadrian made a strategic decision that would define his entire era, a shift from a policy of limitless expansion to one of defensible stability. He declared a new doctrine: Imperium sine fine, empire without end, no longer meant endless conquest, but eternal existence within established, protected borders. This move immediately defined his conflict with the traditional Roman elite, who thought in terms of military glory and territorial gains. He showed that he would not rule like his predecessors. His hero was not Alexander, but Augustus, who had also halted expansion after the disaster in the Teutoburg forest. Hadrian became the first emperor to voluntarily shrink Rome's territory to make it stronger. He chose a secure peace over the dubious glory of a conqueror. And in this decision, the future peacemaker Hadrian was already clear, a man willing to go against everyone for his vision of order and stability. Behind the facade of the wise and rational ruler, behind the image of the philosopher and architect, a powerful, all-consuming, and sometimes dangerous force lurked in the depths of Hadrian's personality, an almost manic obsession with order. This was not just an administrative fondness for systems or a soldier's love of discipline. It was a deep, almost metaphysical need for harmony, symmetry, and complete control over the world around him. Any manifestation of chaos, irrationality, disobedience, or simple asymmetry was perceived by him not as a political or military threat, but as a personal insult, an ugly dissonance in the perfect melody he was trying to compose from his empire. This demon of order was evident in everything. He personally designed buildings, obsessed with ideal proportions and lines. He meticulously reformed the army, standardizing weapons, tactics, and even the layout of camps, turning the legions into a flawlessly tuned machine. He reorganized the imperial bureaucracy, creating a clear hierarchy and system. His famous travels were not just inspections, but acts of imposing order. He interfered in local governance, settled disputes, and approved city building plans. He was, in essence, trying to turn the diverse, patchwork conglomerate of peoples and cultures that was the Roman Empire into a single, logically constructed, and aesthetically complete work of art. But this passion had a dark side. The flip side of a love for order is an absolute intolerance for disorder. When some part of his world refused to obey his will, when some people or phenomenon introduced chaos into his harmony, his reaction was disproportionately brutal. He did not try to negotiate with chaos. He sought to eradicate it, to burn it out with a hot iron, to erect his own flawless order in its place. It is this inner demon, this thirst for absolute control over reality, that is the key to understanding his paradox. Because both the total annihilation of Judea and the unprecedented deification of Antinous were, at their core, two different expressions of the same obsession, a desperate attempt to impose his will upon the world, to erase what did not fit his ideal, and to immortalize what he deemed perfect. Hadrian's reign became an era when stone became the chief instrument of imperial ideology and power. Realizing that further expansion was impossible, the emperor directed Rome's colossal energy not outward, but inward. He began an unprecedented building program that forever changed the face of the empire. If Augustus boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it one of marble, Hadrian could have said that he found an empire of scattered cities and left a single, infrastructurally connected and fortified space. His activity was not limited to the capital. He was the emperor-architect, who personally drew plans, supervised work, and delved into the smallest engineering details. In Rome itself, he rebuilt the Pantheon, crowning it with a giant dome that remains an engineering marvel to this day, a symbol of his universal, all-encompassing power. He erected the colossal Temple of Venus and Roma, emphasizing the divine origin and eternity of the city. But his greatest achievements awaited him in the provinces. In Britain, on the northernmost frontier of the civilized world, he erected a colossal wall, 117 kilometers long, with forts, towers, and ditches. Not just a wall, but a clear declaration of a limit, the physical embodiment of his new defensive doctrine. Along the Rhine and Danube, he strengthened the system of border fortifications known as the limes. In Athens, his spiritual homeland, he completed the gigantic temple of Olympian Zeus, begun 6 centuries earlier, and built an entire new section of the city, Hadrianopolis. He built aqueducts in Carthage, libraries in Ephesus, temples in Egypt. Every new building, every new road, was not just a utilitarian structure. They were visible symbols of Roman order, stability, and eternity. They carried the idea that Rome's power was not violence and plunder, but creation and civilization. Through stone and concrete, Hadrian imposed his vision of harmony on the world, turning the empire into his personal architectural project, where every people and every province was assigned its clear place in the overall, majestic design. Hadrian radically changed the very style of imperial rule. Unlike most of his predecessors, who governed the world from their palaces on the Palatine Hill in Rome, Hadrian was the emperor on the move. He spent the majority of his 21-year reign, about 12 years, outside of Italy, on endless travels through the provinces. This was not a series of idle pleasure trips, but a systematic, exhaustive inspection of every corner of his vast domain. His court became a constantly moving administrative center, capable of resolving any issue on the spot. He crossed the English Channel and reached the northern borders of Britain. He traversed all of Gaul and Spain, reorganized the defense of the German borders, spent several years in Greece, his spiritual homeland, crossed Asia Minor, visited Syria, Judea, Arabia, Egypt, and North Africa. He was the first emperor to see almost his entire empire with his own eyes. These journeys had several goals. First, it was a method of personal control. Hadrian did not trust the reports of governors. He wanted to see the condition of the roads, the discipline in the legions, the needs of the cities for himself. Second, it was a powerful propaganda tool. The emperor's appearance in a distant province showed the inhabitants that they were not forgotten, that they were part of a unified whole, that the supreme power cared for them. He distributed lavish gifts, initiated construction, and settled local disputes, winning popularity and strengthening loyalty. But there was a third, more personal dimension to these travels. Hadrian, obsessed with the idea of order, saw the empire as his personal estate, his garden, which he had to tend to personally, pruning dead branches and nurturing new growth. He was the gardener of civilization. And it was during these endless travels, in the dust of the roads of Asia Minor, that a young man from Bithynia appeared in his entourage, whose name would become synonymous with tragic love and divine ascension: Antinous. He joined the imperial court and became the ruler's constant shadow, a silent witness and participant in this great imperial pilgrimage. The arrival of Antinous in Hadrian's life was an event that went far beyond personal affection and would eventually influence the religion, art, and even politics of the empire. He was a Greek youth from the city of Claudiopolis in the province of Bithynia, modern-day Turkey, born around 111 AD. He was likely introduced to the emperor during one of his journeys through Asia Minor, around 124. What exactly did Hadrian, a mature man of 48, find in this teenager? Ancient sources are scarce and delicate, but the nature of their relationship is not in doubt. It was a deep homoerotic attachment, one that fit perfectly within the traditions of the Greek elite, where a relationship between an adult man, the Erastes, and a youth, the Eromenos, was considered normal and even a high form of love, combining physical attraction with spiritual mentorship. But for Hadrian, it was something far greater. In Antinous, he saw not just an object of passion, but the living, breathing embodiment of his most cherished ideal: Hellenic beauty. For the emperor, whose worldview was steeped in Greek philosophy and aesthetics, who admired the statues of Praxiteles and Phidias and the perfect proportions of the Parthenon, beauty was not just a pleasing form, but a visible manifestation of divine harmony and truth. Antinous, with his classical features, melancholic gaze, and athletic physique, became a living classical statue for Hadrian, his own personal work of art, proof that perfection was possible in this earthly world. He was his muse, his source of inspiration, his silent companion on his long journeys, the ideal spectator for whom he was remaking the world. This obsession with ideal form, embodied in one person, explains why the subsequent loss of Antinous was perceived by Hadrian not just as the death of a loved one, but as a cosmological catastrophe, the collapse of his entire aesthetic and philosophical universe. Despite his successes in strengthening the empire, Hadrian never won the genuine love of the Roman Senate. His relationship with the high aristocracy was poisoned by suspicion and hostility from the very beginning. The execution of 4 prominent consulars, Lucius Publilius Celsus, Avidius Nigrinus, Cornelius Palma, and Lucius Quietus, at the very start of his reign, became an unhealed wound. Although Hadrian swore the order was given without his knowledge, the senators did not believe him. They saw him as a tyrant eliminating potential rivals, and as a provincial upstart who despised ancient Roman traditions. His long absences from the capital, his passion for Greek culture, his rejection of expansionist policy, all of it irritated conservative circles. Hadrian's allies were not the senators, but the forces he relied on, the army and the professional bureaucracy he was creating. He spent more time with the legions than any emperor since Augustus. He personally inspected drills, shared the soldiers' meager rations, and introduced new standards for equipment and discipline. The soldiers respected him for his competence and his care, and this loyalty from the army was his main shield against intrigues in Rome. His second ally was the new class of administrators he recruited from the equestrian order. Professional lawyers, administrators, and financiers who owed their advancement to him personally. He was creating a meritocracy, where careers depended on ability, not on noble birth, which of course angered the hereditary aristocracy even more. His greatest enemy, as yet unseen and intangible, was any form of dissent that challenged his dream of a single, harmonious, Hellenized empire. This might be a senator dreaming of a return to republican freedoms, or a general yearning for Parthian gold. But the most dangerous form of this descent turned out not to be a political conspiracy, but religious conviction. The irreconcilable monotheism of the Jews, their refusal to acknowledge the emperor's divinity and worship pagan idols, was the one element that categorically did not fit into his syncretic model of the world. It was a challenge not just to his power, but to his very ideology, and that is why his collision with this challenge would be so bloody and merciless. In the autumn of 130 AD, the imperial fleet sailed majestically up the Nile. Egypt had always held a special place in the Roman imagination. It was not just a province, but the emperor's personal domain, the breadbasket of the empire, and also a land of ancient, mysterious wisdom, the country of pharaohs and powerful gods who commanded life and death. For Hadrian, the intellectual and mystic, this journey was not only an administrative inspection, but also a spiritual pilgrimage. He visited ancient temples, conversed with priests, and marveled at the colossi of Memnon. The very air of Egypt was saturated with ideas of eternity, the cyclical nature of being, death, and resurrection. The central figure of the Egyptian pantheon was Osiris, a god who was treacherously murdered, dismembered, and then resurrected by the love of his sister wife Isis, becoming the lord of the afterlife. The legend of Osiris, of a god who died and was reborn, resonated deeply with the mystical sentiments of the era. The atmosphere of this journey was heavy, almost fatal. Ancient authors hint at prophecies that foretold the emperor would escape a great danger if someone voluntarily sacrificed themselves for him. It is unknown how true these rumors were, but they accurately convey the oppressive sense of doom that hung over the imperial court. It was here, in this mystical landscape, where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead seemed especially thin, where the river itself was considered a divinity that gave and took life, that the rational and orderly world of Emperor Hadrian would collide with the irrational force of destiny. The river, a symbol of eternal rebirth, was preparing to become a place of eternal loss, and the journey to the wellspring of ancient wisdom, a journey into the heart of his personal darkness. In October of 130, while the imperial fleet was somewhere near the modern-day city of Malawi, tragedy struck, forever dividing Hadrian's life into before and after. Antinous drowned in the Nile. The circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery, giving rise to countless versions and speculations. The official version, most likely, was an accident. The young man carelessly fell overboard and was carried away by the current. However, this prosaic version satisfied few. Hadrian himself, in his memoirs, according to the historian Cassius Dio, leaned toward the version of a ritual self-sacrifice. According to this interpretation, Antinous, aware of some terrible prophecy hanging over the emperor, voluntarily gave his life to save his beloved, sacrificing himself to the waters of the Nile. This version, of course, was far more comforting to the grieving emperor, as it transformed death into an act of supreme devotion and love. There was also a third, more sinister version whispered about at court. Perhaps it was not a voluntary, but a forced sacrifice, carried out with the knowledge or even at the order of Hadrian himself, who was fascinated by mystical practices and might have taken such a step to prolong his own life or preserve his power. The historical truth is lost to us, but from the perspective of the emperor's psychology and the consequences of this event, the precise cause of death is not what matters. What matters is what happened in Hadrian's soul. The death of Antinous was the collapse of his entire universe. In his perfectly ordered, rational, harmonious world, which he had built with such persistence, a black hole of chaos opened up. Death, the most irrational and uncontrollable of all phenomena, had taken from him what he considered the most perfect creation, the living embodiment of beauty. This was not just a blow of fate. It was a challenge thrown down to his power, his intellect, his philosophy. All his walls, legions, laws, and temples were powerless in the face of this loss. And his reaction to this challenge would be no less irrational and unprecedented than the tragedy itself. Hadrian's grief was inhuman, titanic, transgressing all conceivable bounds of propriety and tradition. Roman society, especially its aristocratic elite, valued stoic restraint, the ability to control oneself and not display emotions publicly. A public show of grief was considered unworthy of a man, let alone an emperor. But Hadrian, in the words of the historian Aurelius Victor, wept like a woman. This was not mere mourning. It was a rebellion against death itself, a refusal to accept its verdict. His rational mind, accustomed to finding a solution for every problem, had encountered an unsolvable one, the irreversibility of loss, and he reacted with the fury and will of a demiurge who cannot accept the imperfection of his creation. He refused to let his ideal simply vanish, turn to dust, dissolve into nothingness. If the existing gods allowed such an injustice, if they were powerless to protect perfect beauty, then he, Emperor Hadrian, by the force of his own power, would correct this cosmic error. He threw down a challenge to the entire pantheon, to the entire religious order of the world. His reaction was not that of a grieving man, but of an enraged god. He decided not just to immortalize Antinous' memory, as many had done before by raising statues or dedicating poems. He decided to make him immortal in the most direct, literal sense. He decided to conquer death in the only way available to him, through an act of divine creation. This moment became the turning point in his reign and in his personality. The philosopher on the throne gave way to a magician trying to rewrite the laws of existence. The rational builder of the empire became the irrational creator of a god, driven not by state necessity, but by immeasurable pain and all-consuming love. Emperor Hadrian, wielding absolute power unrivaled by any man on earth, began to execute his mad and magnificent design. He did not simply ask priests to recognize Antinous as a hero or demigod, as was sometimes done. He used the full might of the imperial administrative machine to establish a new, fully fledged cult, equal to those of the ancient Olympians. He officially declared his drowned lover a god. On the banks of the Nile, at the very spot where the tragedy was believed to have occurred, he ordered a new city to be founded, Antinopolis. This was not just a memorial, but a thriving polis with temples, theaters, and streets designed according to all the canons of Greek architecture, populated by Greek colonists and endowed with enormous privileges. Then, a decree was sent throughout the empire establishing the new cult. Priests were appointed, rituals developed, and festivals in honor of the new god were established. An iconography was created. Antinous was depicted in the guise of various gods, Osiris, Dionysus, Hermes, which aided his rapid acceptance in different parts of the Hellenistic world. The most astonishing thing is the scale of this enterprise. Archaeologists find statues of Antinous from Britain to the Danube, but they were especially numerous in the eastern provinces, Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. Hundreds, if not thousands, of his sculpted images have been found, more than those of many other Roman deities, and even some emperors. Hadrian personally supervised the creation of these statues, demanding the embodiment of his ideal of beauty. This was an act without precedent in Roman history. Yes, emperors were deified after death, but that was a political act approved by the Senate. Here, a living emperor, by his own sole will, was creating a god from a non-family member, a provincial youth of questionable reputation. It was not a political act, but a deeply personal, almost intimate one. He did not ask the gods for comfort. He created his own comfort. He did not pray for his beloved's eternal life. He granted it by imperial decree. It was the ultimate act of hubris, and at the same time, the ultimate act of love, a demonstration that the will of one man, vested with absolute power, could attempt to change the very fabric of reality. The world's reaction to the new god was mixed and largely dependent on cultural context. In Rome itself, in the circles of the conservative senatorial aristocracy, this act was met with poorly concealed disgust and contempt. For them, it was a sign of extreme moral decay, shameful Eastern influence, and possibly the emperor's madness. It was one thing to posthumously deify Julius Caesar or Augustus, who had laid the foundations of the empire, but it was quite another to place some provincial boy-lover on par with Jupiter and Mars. Latin authors of the time, like Suetonius or Cassius Dio, write about it with unconcealed irony or condemnation. They saw it as confirmation of their worst fears about the little Greek on the throne, who disdained ancient Roman virtues. But the reaction in the Greek-speaking eastern part of the empire was completely different. Here, where the tradition of Hellenistic ruler gods had existed for centuries, where syncretism and the creation of new cults were commonplace, the idea of deifying Antinous did not seem so shocking. Moreover, it found a vibrant response. For many Greeks, this was an act of Hellenic revival. Hadrian, their Philhellene emperor, had deified not a Roman general, but a beautiful Greek youth, returning the ideal of Kalokagathia, the unity of beauty and goodness, to the pantheon. The cult of Antinous quickly merged with local cults of dying and rising gods, such as Osiris in Egypt or Adonis in Syria. Antinous became a savior god, a comforter, a patron of the grieving. Oracles of Antinous appeared, his miracles were recorded, and people prayed to him for healing. Thus, what was considered a shameful whim in Rome became a vibrant and popular religious phenomenon in the East, one that lasted for several centuries. The empire once again demonstrated its cultural duality. While the Latin West grumbled, the Hellenic East joyfully accepted a new, tragic, and beautiful god, born from the grief and will of one man. While the emperor was consumed by his cosmic grief, creating a new religion and immortalizing Antinous in stone, storm clouds were gathering in the far eastern reaches of his empire, in Judea. The contradictions between Hadrian's Hellenistic universalism and Jewish particularism were reaching a boiling point. The emperor, who sincerely wished for the well-being of all his subjects, saw that well-being in their assimilation into the great Greco-Roman culture. He viewed local customs and religions as relics that should gradually dissolve into a single syncretic melting pot. But what worked with the Gauls or Syrians ran into an insurmountable obstacle in the form of Jewish monotheism. The Jews refused to worship anyone but their one God. For Hadrian, this was not just stubbornness. It was a challenge to his idea of harmony and order. The catalyst for the explosion was two of his decisions. First was the plan to rebuild Jerusalem, still lying in ruins after the War of 70 AD, as a new Roman polis named Aelia Capitolina. Aelia in honor of his family name, Capitolina in honor of Capitoline Jupiter. The pinnacle of this project was to be the construction of a temple to Jupiter on the site of the destroyed Jewish temple, on the Holy of Holies of the Jewish people. For the Jews, this was not just an insult, but a monstrous sacrilege, the abomination of desolation foretold by the prophets. The second decision, the final straw, was an empire-wide decree forbidding bodily mutilation, which, among other barbaric customs, included the Jewish rite of circumcision. To Hadrian, this was a hygienic and humanitarian measure. To the Jews, it was an attack on their covenant with God, on the very essence of their identity. Thus, actions that, from the emperor's perspective, were aimed at civilization and unification, were, from the Jewish perspective, a declaration of war on their faith and their existence. Conflict became inevitable. Against this backdrop of rising popular anger and despair, a figure emerged in Judea capable of leading and organizing the resistance. His name was Shimon bar Kosiba, but history would remember him by the nickname given to him by one of the greatest sages of the time, Rabbi Akiva, Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star. Rabbi Akiva, seeing his strength and charisma, proclaimed him the Messiah, the fulfillment of the ancient prophecy of a star that would rise from Jacob. This immediately elevated the status of the uprising from a simple riot to a holy messianic war for liberation. Shimon bar Kokhba proved to be a brilliant organizer and military commander. For several years, even before the open revolt, he secretly prepared the rebellion. Underground hiding complexes and communication tunnels were created throughout the country, and weapons were stockpiled. There is a tradition that Jewish weaponsmiths, fulfilling orders for the Roman army, intentionally made weapons with slight defects so the Romans would reject them, allowing the rebels to collect and repair them. When the revolt erupted in 132 AD, it caught the Romans by complete surprise. The rebels acted swiftly and brutally, massacring Roman garrisons and seizing control of most of Judea, possibly including Jerusalem itself. They even began to mint their own coins with inscriptions like, "For the freedom of Jerusalem." This was no longer just a revolt. It was the declaration of an independent Jewish state, and it was a direct, undisguised challenge to Hadrian personally and to his entire imperial system. On one side stood the philosopher emperor, the son of Zeus, the builder of a universal Greco-Roman world. On the other, the son of a star, the leader of a people defending their unique identity and their faith in one God. It was a collision of two universes, two irreconcilable worldviews, and in this war, compromise was impossible. One of them had to be destroyed. The scale and initial success of the Bar Kokhba revolt caught Rome off guard and threw Hadrian into a rage. This was not a local disturbance, but a full-scale war that threatened the stability of the entire eastern region. The rebels had annihilated at least one Roman legion, the 22nd Deotariana, and inflicted heavy losses on the 10th Legion Fretensis. It was clear that the local garrison could not extinguish this flame. Hadrian, for whom this revolt was a personal affront to his idea of order, reacted with all seriousness and might. He massed enormous forces in Judea, by some estimates, up to 12 legions with auxiliary troops, nearly a third of the entire Roman army. He recalled his best general, Sextus Julius Severus, from his post as governor of Britain, where he was likely overseeing the construction of Hadrian's Wall, and threw him into suppressing the rebellion. The very act of summoning a general from the other end of the empire testifies to the extreme gravity of the situation. Hadrian gave an order that differed from the usual practice of quelling rebellions. The goal was not simply to defeat the rebel army and punish the ringleaders. The goal was the complete and final solution to the Jewish question, the eradication of the very possibility of such a revolt in the future. This meant destroying not only the army, but its social, economic, and demographic base. The Peacemaker emperor, the builder of defensive walls, now removed all constraints and unleashed the full destructive power of the Roman war machine for a war of total annihilation. His personal offense and his obsession with order demanded not just victory, but the execution of an entire people who had dared to introduce chaos into his harmonious world. Julius Severus, arriving in Judea, quickly assessed the situation. Bar Kokhba's army was large, fanatical, and most importantly, avoided open battles where the Roman legions were invincible. The rebels used guerrilla tactics, relying on a network of fortified settlements and an extensive system of underground tunnels. Engaging them in a decisive battle was pointless and dangerous. Therefore, Severus applied a different, far more brutal and effective strategy, one of scorched earth and slow strangulation. He abandoned quick strikes and moved to a methodical, systematic cleansing of the territory. The Roman army, divided into numerous detachments, began to comb the country square by square. They did not hunt for the enemy army. They destroyed everything that could support it. They burned villages, cut down olive groves and vineyards, destroyed water systems, and sowed the fields with salt to make them barren. Any settlement that offered resistance was wiped from the face of the earth, and its population, men, women, children, was mercilessly slaughtered. This was the total burning of Judea, to which our story's title refers. The Romans were not just fighting soldiers, they were fighting the land itself, the very possibility of life on it. Cassius Dio writes that all of Judea became a desert. This tactic was slow but relentless. Deprived of food, water, and popular support, the rebel bands were forced to either starve to death in their hideouts or come out into the open, where they were surrounded and annihilated one by superior Roman forces. Hadrian, likely stationed nearby and personally overseeing the campaign, approved this tactic. The cruelty of this war was not an accidental excess, but deliberate policy. It was a surgical operation to remove a diseased organ from the body of the empire, and the emperor-architect would not stop until the last infected cell was removed. It is at this moment, in the fire and smoke of the Judean War, that the two seemingly unconnected parts of Hadrian's paradox, his immeasurable grief for Antinous and his immeasurable cruelty toward the Jews, merge into a single tragic picture. The fury he unleashed on Judea was not just cold political calculation. It was deeply personal, fed by the same spiritual wound that had driven him to create a new god. The death of Antinous had dealt a crushing blow to his faith in harmony and order, proving that irrational, chaotic forces existed in the universe beyond his control. This chaos had shattered his personal world, and now, in the Judean revolt, he encountered what he saw as the same irrational chaos, but this time in the political world. The Jews' stubborn refusal to accept his Hellenistic universal model, their fanatical, in his view, devotion to their invisible, exclusive God, was all a manifestation of the same disharmony, the same ugly disorder that had taken Antinous from him. The Jews became for him the symbolic embodiment of all the dark, irrational forces he hated and feared. His war against them became a kind of psychotherapy, a sublimation of his grief and anger. He could not punish fate for the death of his beloved, but he could punish those who, he felt, were bringing disorder to his empire. In destroying Judea, He was metaphorically trying to destroy the very source of chaos in the world, trying by force, fire, and sword to restore the order that had been shattered in his own soul. Thus, the creation of a god from a lover and the genocide of a people were two answers to the same existential problem. How does a man with absolute power and an absolute belief in order vanquish chaos? One answer was an act of creation, the other an act of destruction. But both were born from the same source, the wounded soul of a tyrant aesthete. The last bastion of the revolt was the mighty fortress of Betar, located southwest of Jerusalem. Here, Shimon bar Kokhba himself took refuge, along with his last, most loyal fighters and many civilians. The siege of Betar in the summer of 135 AD became the climax and final act of the entire war. The Romans, using all their expertise in siege warfare, surrounded the fortress with a wall and ditches, cutting it off from the outside world. The siege was long and agonizing. According to Jewish traditions recorded in the Talmud, the defenders fought with desperate courage, and their leader, Bar Kokhba, performed miracles of heroism. But the forces were too unequal. The Romans methodically brought up siege engines and dug tunnels. Finally, on the 9th day of Av, a day already marked in Jewish history as the day of destruction for both the first and second temples, the fortress fell. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Roman soldiers, embittered by the long and difficult war, spared no one. Talmudic sources, though prone to hyperbole, paint an apocalyptic picture. Blood flowed in rivers, so much that it carried stones to the sea. Bar Kokhba himself died in the fighting, and with his death, the last hope for liberation died too. The fall of Betar marked the final defeat of the revolt. Rome's victory was total and unconditional. Hadrian, when reporting the end of the war to the Senate, did not even use the traditional opening, "I and the army are well," because the victory had been won at too high a price for the Roman legions as well. But for Judea, this was not just a military catastrophe. It was the end of an era, the end of a Jewish state and political presence in their own land for the next 1800 years. The final act of the tragedy was over, and silence fell over the land of Judea. Victorious in war, Hadrian was not satisfied with simply suppressing the rebellion. His goal was something more: the complete and final erasure of Jewish identity from the map of the world, a cultural genocide. He wanted to kill not only the people, but their memory, their history, their connection to their land. Immediately after the fall of Betar, he began to implement this program. The first step was renaming the province. The name Judea, directly linked to the Jewish people, was abolished. In its place, the province received a new artificial name, Syria Palestina. The name Palestina was taken from the Philistines, the ancient enemies of Israel, which was a deliberate and sophisticated humiliation. Thus, with a stroke of the pen, the land of Israel vanished from official Roman maps. The next step was the total destruction of Jerusalem as a Jewish center. The city was completely rebuilt on a Roman model and settled by pagans. It was officially renamed Aelia Capitolina. On the Temple Mount, where Solomon's temple had once stood, a temple to Jupiter Capitolinus was erected, and by a twist of fate, a temple to Venus was built on the site of Golgotha. Jews were forbidden from entering the city on pain of death. According to the early Christian author Eusebius, they were permitted only once a year, on the anniversary of the temple's destruction, to approach the city walls to mourn their loss. The ban on circumcision was confirmed and enforced, as was the ban on the public study of the Torah. Hadrian tried to rip out, by the roots, everything that made Jews Jewish. This was his last, most brutal attempt to impose his order. He could not assimilate this culture, could not fit it into his harmonious Hellenic model, and so he decided to simply erase it, destroy it, consign it to oblivion. He acted like an obsessed architect who, finding an unfixable crack in his perfect building, decides to demolish the entire wall. The emperor's final years were spent at his famous villa in Tivoli, near Rome. This was not just a country estate, but an entire microcosm, a world in miniature, which became a monument to his reign and his soul. On its vast territory, he ordered recreations of the most famous and beloved corners of the empire: the Academy in Athens, the Canopus Canal of Egypt, the Vale of Tempe in Greece. It was a refuge, a golden cage, in which the aging and sick ruler tried to hide from the world and from himself. The great traveler, who had crisscrossed the empire, was now chained by illness to his artificial paradise. He suffered, likely from dropsy, which caused severe swelling and pain. His temperament, never gentle, soured completely. He became suspicious, irritable, at times cruel. Rumors circulated in Rome of his fits of rage, of executions carried out on the slightest suspicion of conspiracy. The creator of perfect order seemed to be sinking deeper into his own inner chaos. Surrounded by the greatest works of art, by statues, many of them depicting the deified Antinous, he was profoundly alone. His wife, Vibia Sabina, with whom he had a cold relationship, died, and malicious gossip suggested he had poisoned her. He outlived most of his friends and companions. The builder who had united the world was left alone in the center of the universe he had created, which now seemed to him a prison. The villa at Tivoli became the final, most poignant symbol of his paradox. It was a place of perfect, artificial harmony, created by a man whose soul had been torn apart by the real, imperfect world. Even on his deathbed, Hadrian remained true to his greatest passion: establishing order. Having no children of his own, he faced the most critical problem of any monarch: succession. Whether the system of stability he had created would endure, or whether the empire would plunge back into the chaos of civil war, depended on his decision. His first choice fell on Lucius Aelius Verus, whom he adopted in 136. However, Aelius was a man of weak health and died before Hadrian did. This failure was a heavy blow to the emperor. Sick and despairing, he made his second, and as it turned out, brilliant choice. He adopted the 52-year-old, respected and childless senator Antinous, who would become known to history as Antoninus Pius. But Hadrian gave him one unprecedented condition. Antoninus, in turn, must immediately adopt two young men: the 17-year-old Marcus Annius Verus, the future Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and the 7-year-old Lucius Verus, the son of the deceased Aelius Verus. Thus, Hadrian, on his deathbed, was building a dynastic line 2 generations deep. He was choosing not just a successor, but his successor's successor. He was trying to program the future, to ensure the continuity of his policy of peace and stability for decades to come. This decision revealed the essential Hadrian: his foresight, his drive for control, his desperate desire to conquer the chaos and unpredictability of history. He could not defeat his own death, but he tried to ensure that his life's work, his orderly empire, would live on after him. This act was his last great architectural project, a project to build the future, and it proved surprisingly successful. The reigns of Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius became the golden age of the Roman Empire, the zenith of the peace and prosperity whose foundations their controversial predecessor had laid. Emperor Hadrian died on the 10th of July, 138 AD, at his villa in Baiae, at the age of 62. His death was agonizing. His illness caused him such suffering that he begged his servants and doctors to give him poison or kill him with a sword. But no one dared to raise a hand against the master of the world. His end held the final, most bitter irony of his fate. The man who had traveled his entire life, who had crossed every sea and walked every road of his vast empire, died as a virtual prisoner, unable to move. The architect of universal harmony, who rebuilt cities and codified laws, departed this life in agony, in a state of complete physical and mental discord. The Peacemaker, who stopped wars and fortified borders, never found peace in his own soul, torn by grief for his lost lover, and perhaps by the ghosts of the hundreds of thousands killed in Judea. His death caused no grief in Rome. The Senate, which hated him, immediately resolved to condemn his memory, damnatio memoriae, to erase his name from all official documents and tear down his statues. To the senators, he had remained a tyrant, a man who executed their colleagues and ruled without regard for their opinion. Only the insistence and authority of his successor, Antinous Pius, who threatened to abdicate if his adoptive father was not deified, saved Hadrian from posthumous disgrace. With great difficulty, the Senate agreed to his official deification. And so the man who, in life, had created a god from his lover, was only barely, by a miracle, numbered among the gods himself after his death. The circle was complete, leaving behind a story of power, loneliness, and the futile attempt of a man to impose his order on the relentless course of reality. On his deathbed, as his body refused to serve him and his mind drifted between pain and memory, Hadrian reportedly composed a short, piercing poem addressed to his own soul. These 5 lines, passed down to us in the Historia Augusta, became his most famous and perhaps his most honest self-portrait. Animula, vagula, blandula, hospes comesque corporis, quae nunc abibis in loca, pallidula, rigida, nudula, nec ut soles dabis aiokos. In English, it translates roughly to, "Wandering gentle little soul, my body's guest and companion. Where will you go now? Pale, cold, and naked, and no longer sharing jests, as you once did." In these lines, there is no word of empires, victories, laws, or majestic buildings. There is no emperor, no general, no tyrant. There is only a man, gazing with tenderness and sorrow at his own fragile essence, standing on the threshold of the unknown. This is the last and sharpest manifestation of his paradox. The man who thought in terms of continents and centuries, who moved legions, founded cities, and erased peoples from the earth, finds himself, in his final hour, alone not with his power, but with his trembling, frightened self. The poet, the philosopher, the sensitive and reflective intellectual who hid his whole life behind the mask of a stern soldier and all-powerful ruler, finally removes it. This poem is the key to his personality. It shows that behind all his titanic deeds, both creative and destructive, there was not a soulless mechanism of power, but a living, complex, suffering man who spent his life seeking harmony in the external world, because perhaps he could not find it within himself. And this last, farewell jest to his own soul is an admission of the futility of all his efforts in the face of the great mystery of existence. So what did Emperor Hadrian leave behind? His legacy is as dual and contradictory as he was. On one hand, it is a legacy carved in stone, one that defined the contours of Western civilization. The majestic dome of the Pantheon in Rome still boggles the mind. Hadrian's Wall in northern England, stretching for dozens of kilometers, remains the largest Roman monument in Britain, a symbol of an unbreachable border and of order. His legal reforms, codified in the Perpetual Edict, formed the basis of Roman law for centuries. The era he began, continued by the Antonines, went down in history as the pinnacle of the Pax Romana, a time of unprecedented prosperity, stability, and security. He was the wise ruler, the philosopher on the throne that Plato had dreamed of. But there is the other side of his legacy, one written in blood and tears. For the Jewish people, his name became synonymous with destroyer, a persecutor comparable to Nebuchadnezzar. The Bar Kokhba War and the subsequent repressions led to a demographic catastrophe, put an end to Jewish statehood in the Holy Land, and became one of the decisive factors in the final formation of the diaspora. The trauma inflicted by Hadrian left a deep scar on the historical memory of the Jewish people. And alongside this, there is the strange, almost surreal legacy of the cult of Antinous. This artificially created god, born of love and grief, outlived his creator by several centuries, leaving behind thousands of beautiful, melancholic statues that grace the world's museums today. Thus, Hadrian left behind both a world at peace and a desert, the most perfect examples of law and architecture, and the memory of a genocide, the image of a wise Stoic, and the exotic cult of a deified lover. He was both a builder and a destroyer, and his legacy will forever remain a monument to how closely creation and annihilation can be intertwined in a single great personality. And so we return to the central question posed at the beginning: why? Why did the Emperor Peacemaker burn Judea and declare his drowned lover a god? The key to this paradox lies not in politics or strategy, but in the psychology of absolute power multiplied by the worldview of an artist perfectionist. Hadrian was not just an emperor, he was a demiurge, who saw the entire Roman Empire as his personal canvas, as material for creating a perfect work of art. His ideal was clear: a single, harmonious, universal Greco-Roman civilization, living in peace and order under the protection of just laws and eternal beauty. He was not a hypocrite. His peace was a real peace, his order a real order. But the problem was, he could not tolerate the slightest dissonance, not one false note in his universal symphony. Jewish monotheism, with its exclusivity and refusal to dissolve into the pagan world, was exactly that false note. It was not just political disobedience, it was an aesthetic deformity, a philosophical error that ruined the harmony of his entire design. And like an artist who finds a stain on his canvas that cannot be washed away, he decided to cut that piece from the canvas. His cruelty was the cruelty of a perfectionist striving for ideal purity. In exactly the same way, but with the opposite sign, he reacted to the death of Antinous. The loss of the living embodiment of ideal beauty was an invasion of ugly, irrational chaos into his perfect world. It was a blemish on his creation, and he could not accept it. If the existing laws of existence allowed such an imperfection, he would write new ones by the force of his will. The deification of Antinous was not just an act of grief, it was the act of a creator who refuses to accept reality and creates his own corrected version. He burned Judea because it was an ugly dissonance that had to be eliminated. He created a god from Antinous because he was a perfect harmony that had to be made eternal. Both acts, one of ultimate destruction, the other of ultimate creation, were born from the same source: the will of an artist on the throne who tried to force an imperfect world to conform to his perfect ideal. Hadrian's story is not just the biography of a Roman emperor. It is an eternal and frighteningly relevant cautionary tale about the nature of power and the dangers of idealism without limits. It shows us that the noblest intentions, when backed by absolute power, can create monsters. Hadrian sincerely believed he was bringing peace, order, civilization, and beauty to his subjects. He was, without a doubt, one of the most educated, intelligent, and effective rulers in history. But it was precisely his intellect, his unshakable faith in his own righteousness, and his own aesthetic ideal that made him capable of monstrous cruelty. His tragedy is the tragedy of the philosopher on the throne, who became so convinced of his model of the world that he felt he had the right to destroy anything that did not fit. Hadrian's story teaches us that the greatest crimes are not always committed by obvious villains, but often by idealists seeking to build paradise on earth according to their own blueprints. It forces us to think about the price of order and about the line between creation and violence. And finally, his personal drama, his desperate attempt to conquer death by deifying a loved one, reminds us of the eternal human yearning for immortality and of how the deeply personal tragedies of one person, when vested with power, can change the course of history, create new gods, and erase ancient peoples from the earth. Hadrian wanted to be the architect of an eternal peace, but his story leaves us with a disturbing question. Is any attempt to build a final, perfect harmony on earth inevitably a path to violence against those who disagree with that harmony? It is a lesson carved in the stone of the Pantheon and written in the ashes of Judea, and it remains relevant to this day.